Hi guys! Thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Lara. In today's video we will go over 8 different types of buttons. The first type of buttons we are going to look at are flat buttons. They are, as the name suggests, flat and they have holes through the top. So they can have either 4 holes like this group over here or simply 2 holes like these few buttons here in the right bottom corner. They can be differently thick. So when you look at this one, this is a really thick button, while the large one here is rather thinner. The sizes can differ, even the shapes. They don't have to be necessarily round, and they can be made of different materials. So for example, these few here have been made of plastic. This is a metal button. This button has been made of partially metal and partially plastic. These two are wooden buttons. This is again plastic, even though this looks like some natural material, but it's plastic. And this is a vintage button. I have a few of these. I got them from my mom, and that's been made of mother of pearl. Flat buttons can be used for many different projects. So for example, these small flat buttons are buttons you would usually use for the closure of a polo shirt or a button-down shirt, but that doesn't mean that you can't use them somewhere else. So if you would create some item that would need a subtle closure, you could use a small button like this. These are a little bit bigger, so I would see these on a waistband of a skirt or pants, but you can still use them for button-down shirts if you want to have bigger buttons. These are a little bit thicker, so they would be great for jackets, for anything that's made of a little bit thicker material, or for coats. You could use these for sweaters or for coats as well. And in general, if you have a nice variety of buttons that look great to you together, you could even use them as embellishment. So you would grab a group of various buttons and stitch them somewhere on if that would look good to you. So it's always up to you. Yes, there are several guidelines what certain types of buttons are good for, but that doesn't mean that you can't bend the rules as long as it looks good to you and as long as it works for you. The next type of buttons are shank buttons. Shank buttons don't have any holes in the top. Instead of that, they have a shank, or if you want, a loop on the bottom that you use in order to stitch them on. They can be differently high, meaning when I stitch them on, they will be slightly elevated over the fabric where I stitch them on. And the space between the fabric and the button always depends on the size of the shank. So I have here, for example, this button where the shank is really short, while the shank on this button is a little bit bigger. So if I would stitch the little metal button on, it would create more space between the fabric and the button. And that's always great when you're working with thick materials, where when you close your piece, you want to have enough space between this layer of fabric and between the layer of fabric where is the buttonhole, so that it fits nicely underneath the button without being squashed. They are also very pretty very often, because you can see some of them have some motifs and they are very decorative. Really nice type of buttons. They come just like the flat buttons in different sizes and shapes, and they can be also made of different materials. Here we have the next type of buttons. These are stud buttons. It's the same principle like shank buttons, so these buttons are slightly elevated over their position, which makes them great for any pieces made of thicker materials. And you probably recognize the typical design. They are usually the buttons you would use for denim. They consist of 2 sides. So you have this side that looks like a shank button, and then there is this little piece for the other side that's pointy. So you find the perfect position for your button, pinch this side through, and then you put this piece on and either hammer it in place or squeeze it in place. So since they do not have to be stitched on, they save a little bit of time. However, you have to keep in mind that once you position these and once you hammered these on, it's almost impossible to take them off again. And even if you would manage that, there would be a hole because you pinch this side through. So you have to measure really well. But other than that, great buttons, they look nice and they are very sturdy. toggle buttons. These are buttons that you would see very often on, for example, duffel coats or traditional clothing. Just like any other type of buttons, they come in different sizes and shapes, and they can be made of different materials. But in addition to that, you can buy either just the buttons or a complete closure, like this one, for example. The buttons that you buy separately can have holes that can be differently big. So this one has rather larger holes. So you could use any type of cord that's rather thick for these, and you could simply pull it through yourself. You could create a closure. So you have always one side for your closure. On one side will be the button, and on the other side there will be a loop that you pull over the button, just like here on the closure, that is store-bought and ready to be stitched on. These toggle buttons have rather smaller holes, so either you would use a thinner cord, or you could simply use the very same cord that I just pulled through the big one, and you would create your closure, one side for the button, one side for the loop, and you would simply stitch these toggle buttons with smaller holes on the cord, and it would work just as fine. I have used these in several projects exactly the way I just described, and it looked really pretty and worked great. Definitely a great type of buttons, not necessarily something you would use for your everyday projects, but certainly something that makes your piece look a little bit fancy. Next, I have here fabric buttons that can be customized. So they come in a set that looks pretty much like this. The buttons can be differently big, and they consist of 3 sides. So I have here this metal plate. When you turn it, it has a little teat around the edge, and that's the main part of the button. This little plastic piece is the shank, and this little metal ring is a piece that will then hold the shank in place. And these two things help creating the buttons. So when you're working with a certain type of fabric and you want to have matching buttons, you simply cut out a little circle, put it over this black piece, then you position the main piece for the button in. You grab this, position the loop of the shank inside, and you would push the shank in place, and then you would grab the metal piece and push it on the shank so that it would close and so that it would hold the shank in place, and that way you would create buttons like this. So this is what they look like when I turn them. Really a nice idea whenever you are working on a project where it's important for you that the buttons would be made of the same material like the piece you're working on. The next group of buttons we have here are decorative buttons. Just like any other type of buttons we discussed, they come in different sizes and shapes, and they can be made of different materials. Some decorative buttons are meant purely as an embellishment, while some are both pretty and practical. So all these buttons are basically shank buttons that you could use for closures because the buttonholes would have a reasonable size. This one is pretty large and the buttonhole would have to be too big, so that's a type of decorative button I would really use just as an embellishment. These are snap buttons or shortly snaps. There are 2 main differences between the type of snaps. So either you have to hammer them on, which would be these over here, or you have to stitch them on. So that's this group. The sew-on snaps can be made of plastic, that would be the example, or of metal. And of course, any of these can come in different sizes. The sew-on snaps consist of 2 pieces in total. So you have always the top piece and the bottom piece. The snaps that you have to hammer on consist of 4 pieces in total. So you have 2 pieces for the top and 2 pieces for the bottom. These come always with some kind of tools. So I have here 2 examples of the systems that are out there, and these are not the only systems. They might look even different. Usually there is some kind of a holder with plates that you can exchange according to which side you are about to hammer on. You always have to make a hole in the place where you want to have your snap, and then you have to hammer them on. So that's pretty permanent, while when you stitch your snaps on and you decide later you want to have different closure, you can still change your mind, which is pretty much impossible with these. However, these look much fancier at the end of the day, so they are great for example, functional jackets or denim skirts if they are buttoned down, or you can use them for winter jackets, for example. And of course, when you buy the snaps that have to be hammered on, not only they come with the tools that you'll need, but there's always a leaflet included with the instructions, and it's usually explained very well step by step so that you would be able to follow the instructions even if you never use these. And last but not least, I have here cufflinks. The main difference between cufflinks and regular buttons is that regular buttons will be stitched on permanently on the clothing, while a cufflink is a separate piece. So when you look at a man's shirt, you would have cuffs with buttonholes on one side and stitched on buttons on the other side when it would be a regular shirt. Or you could have a cuff that would have buttonholes on each side, and these would be closed with cufflinks. So I have here two types of cufflinks. So this one looks like a shank button, but it has also a flat piece on the opposite side. Or there is a second type that I have here, which has this pin. So I would pull this pin through both buttonholes on the cuff, and then I could simply open it. It would snap in place and the cuff would be secure. Now this button is the same principle like this little cufflink, but it's not meant for men's shirts. That is a button we used for old bed sheets that we used to have when I was a kid. So back then we lived in a big house where there were like about 70 flats in the building. And in the cellar they had an industrial press that people could use for large towels or bed sheets. But the bed sheets wouldn't go through the press if they had buttons. And that's why they used to make back then bed sheets. They were closed with a closure that had 2 rows of buttonholes, and then people would simply put in these buttons, and then when they would want to wash them, they would take the buttons out and then they could press them in the industrial press, which saved also a lot of time. But that is it for all the types of buttons I wanted to show you. And now let's talk shortly about the storage of buttons. So depending on the amount of buttons you own, you can always go ahead and buy some type of a box with little compartments into which you could sort your buttons by any criterion that makes sense to you. So you could sort them by the size, by the type, by the shape, by the color, and whatnot. I personally have quite a big amount of buttons because my mom was a professional seamstress, and when she retired she gave me all the things she had at home. So I have several boxes full of buttons, and if I were to sort them in some fancy boxes with little compartments and I had to buy these, that would be quite a lot of money. So I personally like repurposing, for example, jars from hair conditioners or body lotions or simple mason jars for the storage of my buttons. So for example, here in this mason jar, I have the snaps that have to be hammered on together with the tools and the instructions. And then I have here these 2 jars from cosmetics that I use for the storage of some other buttons. And then I have several storage boxes with simply Ziplocs in them. And what my mom did when she gave me these buttons, and I highly appreciate it, she even went on and took groups of buttons and tied them together with a thread so that it would be easier to sort through. Now she did it with the buttons that look kind of similar, and then I have here Ziplocs that are filled with buttons that are very easily sorted through without tying them together. But that's definitely a great idea, how to sort your buttons and make sure that you can easily find the buttons that belong together if you have more types of buttons in one baggie. So I have a box that is filled with these, and then I have boxes that are filled with jars like that. I think ideally you would also take some kind of stickers and you would put them on the jars that are not see-through, and you would write down what types of buttons or what colors are in there, so that it would be easier for you to sort through if you have a larger amount. So that was it for today. I hope that you found this video helpful and that you enjoyed watching it. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy sewing!